I know, trust me, I know. There are a ton of good reasons to go for Nvidia. Or are there? Hang on, stop the list. Go back. Yet, not many of those commonly quoted reasons are valid for most people, and Nvidia is by far the more expensive option. So why is the average gamer 5 times more likely to have an Nvidia GPU in their system? In fact, even for me personally, my last 5 cards are the RTX 4070 Ti, the 3080, the 2080 Ti, a Shroud modded 1060, and the RX 470. And you'll notice that only one of those cards wasn't an Nvidia GPU. So what's changed recently that has me breaking this 6-year-long commitment to Nvidia and switching back to AMD? Well, maybe the better question is, why is everyone seemingly making the switch to AMD? Because everything seems to suggest that Nvidia is the better option. They must be with that much market share. Ray tracing, Nvidia. Upscaling, Nvidia. Stability, streaming, content creation, all favor Nvidia. These are things that you likely would have heard in the argument for Nvidia versus AMD or Intel. And when you look at it like that, how can you not go for Nvidia if everything is telling you they are the best and other GPU manufacturers are to be avoided? Well, we are going to cover why Nvidia tends to be the default option, legitimate reasons and misconceptions as to why they are better, the frustrations I am currently facing with them, and ultimately swap to AMD, and investigate some of the primary differences in game with some really interesting results. So we will either save hundreds of dollars or reveal that AMD really is as bad as some people say. Let's find out. So I have a question. Are you an avid PC enthusiast stuck with that ugly ass Windows watermark ruining your gaming and streaming experience? Well, I have great news for you. Whokeys is a software licensing website dedicated to getting you affordable keys. And the best part is you can get rid of that watermark in a matter of minutes. All you need to do is head down to the video description, click the sponsor link and enjoy an additional 25% off using my coupon code TL20. With PayPal checkout and quick key delivery, all you need to do is hit the Windows key, type activate and paste your key right here to become fully activated. It really is that simple and that cheap. So head down to the video description if that sounds right for you. And thank you Whokeys for sponsoring this video. When you're spending so much money on a GPU, most people only really have one chance to get it right. You just can't go out and buy a 7800 XT for $500, realize it doesn't do what you want it to, sell it for $400, then make up the difference and ultimately buy a 4070. Because at that point, you're now $100 down, not accounting for taxes and any sort of fees. So buying the 4070 to begin with may actually be the cheaper option. Because yes, that AMD GPU is more powerful, but maybe giving up a little bit of raw performance for more features and peace of mind is the right option. But in my experience, only some of those reasons to go for Nvidia are valid, though definitely not all of them. But that's also not really fair of me to say either. I was already honest with you guys, I haven't daily driven an AMD GPU in 6 years, and testing a GPU isn't the same as an ownership experience, is it? So it's pretty hypocritical of me to keep recommending AMD based on hard data, but not put my own money where my mouth is, and legitimately embrace the AMD experience, for better or for worse, and document what I find for you guys, as the counter arguments against Nvidia are really starting to bother me. Outrageous pricing that likely won't get better while AI demand is still high. Memory capacities that make Nvidia ray tracing perform worse than their competitors. Even company ethics forcing their partners to question the viability of their business. I'm very conscious and really not happy with the current trajectory of these trends and what they mean for us in a couple generations time. But even outside of that, talking more personally, I can't take my gaming system upstairs because apparently Nvidia doesn't play nicely with my Sony TV. I use a mirrorless camera as a webcam, which constantly freezes during activity spikes, like opening an application, which may be unrelated but seems to be linked to GPU usage. The last time I tried to use the Nvidia overlay to record something, it literally shit itself and Overwatch for a couple months, and my monitor's backlight refuses to go to sleep, which I suspect may be a Windows 11 thing, but it has persisted through one Windows reinstall and many driver updates, so we'll have to see if AMD can fix that. But I'm not here to gloss over any AMD issues either, nor am I expecting this switch to go 100% smoothly. But AMD drivers have come a long way since the Vega days, though AMD issues do seem more common than Nvidia ones, with the most recent big one being CS2 accounts getting banned through using an AMD GPU feature. And it doesn't even matter who is at fault here, it's things like this that damage brand reputation, and at a minimum suggest to people that AMD is the less refined option. And if they aren't good, these videos will still be a good example of reasons to avoid them. And I'm excited to do some graphics and upscaling quality comparisons later in my initial tests, to really see the differences between AMD and Nvidia rendering. But now we better understand what people commonly say are reasons to go for Nvidia. I told you before that I don't think all of them are valid, so let me explain that. And let's break down two things before we switch to AMD. How many of these I feel are actually valid reasons, and what are the negatives for Nvidia, or the positives for AMD? Because we don't want to be in a situation like the 4070 example I gave earlier, potentially buying an AMD card for it to either be a crashy mess or just not work the way we need it to. So let's start with one of my more controversial takes, ray tracing performance, and I'm going to say it's overrated. Because of its massive performance hit, most people consider it an unjustifiable disadvantage in any competitive game, so only single-player games then. But one of the best examples is path tracing in Cyberpunk, which averages in the 20 FPS range at 1440p on the $800 RTX 4070 Ti. Even ray tracing high only gets into the 40s, so as ray tracing gets more advanced with better effect implementation, this $800 current generation GPU still won't be able to keep up. So upscaling and frame generation then, which is basically becoming a requirement for a playable ray tracing experience. And again, Nvidia does have the advantage, but these videos will investigate how much and if it's worth the additional cost increase. Market share can be a good indication of experiences, or it could just be marketing doing a good job, and I consider neither of them to be a good reason to go for one brand over another without something more concrete to back it up. Stability sentiment seems to carry a lot of weight, as it's one of the more common reasons I see for people to recommend Nvidia. And given the issues I'm having, let's not pretend it's perfect for Team Green. Additional software features like RTX Voice are a really nice thing to have, but AMD do have a competing feature for most. And similarly to streaming, if you're doing anything other than casual use of it, you're really building out a proper solution, like decent sound treatment or a dedicated PC. But professional applications and content creation, they do tend to favor Nvidia, though AMD seem to be making a big push here, which is one thing I am eager to test. But do you know what's funny? I just realized that all of the reasons to go for Nvidia need a decent amount of context, but the counter-arguments are actually quite simple. By defaulting to Nvidia, without at least considering another option, you basically say that high prices, poor value, and a deprioritization of gaming over crypto and AI is absolutely fine, and Nvidia will likely abuse that right up until the limit. Let's face it. You then couple this with the fact that AMD will give you more performance for your money, or similar performance for less money in what people play the most, and add in the fact that AMD tends to equip their cards with more memory, potentially increasing their useful lifespan. And I would also argue a much more usable software experience. These are simple things, but simple things with a much bigger impact. So it's starting to look like AMD is the better option, provided they can deliver a good experience. Which means it is time to cut Nvidia loose, say goodbye and embrace Team Red. But I can't do that for every system I own, for legitimate work-related reasons, which is why I've been using Nvidia for so long, but that changes today. So what system and what AMD card are we talking about? Well, this is where I had to take some necessary precautions to make this as relevant as possible for you guys. This is my main editing system that uses the 13900K and an RTX 3080. I went Nvidia specifically for this machine, as it needs to be as stable as possible in Premiere Pro. But it would be rather interesting to see how far AMD has come, making it a solid contender for this series, if it wouldn't interfere with my editor to an unreasonable degree. Okay, we're doing this apparently. The next option is this system that runs the main set, using a 3600X and a 3060 Ti. There wasn't really a fundamental reason to go for Nvidia, which is unlike my editing system, but I chose the 3060 Ti KO edition right there from Asus because it's a duplicate card for me. I already have the 3060 Ti Founders Edition, which I prefer to test with. But going AMD here is potentially an even better option for two reasons. Using AMD really shouldn't matter for what this system does. And if I do, the entire system would be all AMD. But as you can imagine, there's not a lot that I do with this system outside of a few very specific things that most people can't relate to, which brings us on to the next system, which many of you have probably seen before in a different form. This used to be my Ncase M1 build that I have been using and upgrading for a few years now, but moved the whole system into the O11 Mini a couple months back and upgraded the GPU to the 4070 Ti in preparation for this video to experience Nvidia frame generation as more of a first-hand account for me personally instead of just testing it over at the test bench. This will be especially useful with AMD recently releasing FSR3 frame generation to compete with Nvidia, and we'll have to see how they compare. The reason I wanted to do the AMD challenge with this system is that it's the one I use the most, especially for gaming. Otherwise, what I realistically do most of the days on that computer is script write, research, Photoshop, and light usage of Premiere Pro. So AMD needs to be able to handle that for me to keep the card in my system. Otherwise, I'm just going to have to revert back to Nvidia, but I guess we'll find out. It has a 5800X CPU, which is very popular, and would make the entire system AMD to get the full experience. So now we just need a GPU to put in there, and I have shortlisted two options. This was my original choice, the 6950 XT. I really wanted to go for this card as it's a prime example of the AMD Nvidia conundrum. Because it dropped from 1100 to around 500 to 600, I've been recommending it as the best value high-end card for months, before the release of the 7800 XT, which at $500 was a solid recommendation in our best value GPU series. Both of these cards are a bit faster than the 3080 and a bit slower than the 4070 Ti I upgraded to, but both are considerably cheaper than either of the Nvidia cards, unless you were buying used. So really is a toss-up here. But I like the 7800 XT as it's the latest generation, while also likely to be an extremely popular card this time around, making this entire experiment more relatable for you guys. And given that it is a new card, if AMD's track record is anything to go by, I'm expecting the performance to increase over time, as it has done with the 6950 XT. Though driver stability is likely going to be worse on the 7800 XT, given that it's a new architecture, which could be a negative for my experience, but would be a positive for this video and you guys getting a real understanding of the experience I'm having, and whether you can put up with it, whether we're getting massive driver issues that just really should be avoided. So I'm leaning 7800 XT, but a side note in my personal life is we recently rescued this little princess. This is Luna, and she loves cuddles. But to my disappointment, I recently found out that she's Team Blue for some reason. Maybe she knows something about Intel's next generation I don't. But I'm going to let Luna decide between these two cards in the most unbiased way possible. Good girl. 7800 XT it is. So let's drop this card into our system and check out some of the gameplay differences between Nvidia and AMD, now that I have fully embraced Team Red. One DDU later to uninstall the Nvidia drivers, and it is time to install the AMD card. Now I'm expecting this to go reasonably smoothly. It's not that much bigger. I think it's roughly the same size as the 4070 Ti. Might actually be a little bit slimmer. But what we're going to need is a chopstick. This is a pro tool for PC building, and I'll show you why. There we go. And now you can remove the GPU without scratching it because it's wood. Get one. So if the internet is to be believed, then once we install this, what should happen is 3, 2, 1. So we are now installed with the AMD 7800 XT, and there's a few things that I want to do. Number one is figure out what broke in the process. I'm imagining that there have been a few bug replacements, as in some of the issues that I was having with Nvidia, I'm hoping that we can solve with this AMD card, but I'm also assuming that there'll be some additional issues to deal with. So we're going to figure those out, as well as do some gameplay comparisons. I ran probably something like 30 to 40 different runs of Cyberpunk, see if there's any visual differences, any upscaling differences. I don't think that we can do frame generation, as FSR3 isn't released on Cyberpunk yet. Hopefully yet. But let's find out what the differences are between this GPU and the 4070 I just replaced. Let's take a look. So what I think is the fairest thing to do right here is to leave as much as possible on default or auto to get the raw user experience from each manufacturer. Typically, I am far more strict about this for benchmarks, but as most people will just DDU, drop in their card and play, I want to have the same experience that you would to make this video as relevant as possible for you. But before we game, let's figure out what issues AMD fixed and see if they caused anything to get worse. So the first thing that I wanted to look at is if I have fixed the biggest issue I was facing while the Nvidia GPU was installed. I will test everything before the follow-up video, but the issue that's had the greatest potential for costing me a lot of money is the 24/7 backlight issue. So having done nothing more than install the Adrenaline application and setting the timeout to 1 minute, it is time to test. Now go to sleep. That one's off, that one's off. Perfect. So it was to do with Nvidia. Or at least something to do with Windows and Nvidia, which is kind of the same thing. So that alone might have just saved me hundreds of dollars from monitors dying prematurely, which I'm extremely happy about. But there was another issue that I was trying to fix that didn't go as smoothly for AMD. Remember the webcam freezing? Yeah, it don't freeze no more. As I did a fresh Windows install trying to fix issues when I was using the Nvidia card, I think it's only fair that we allow AMD the same, and I'll have to update you on this as well as any other bugs I find in the follow-up video. But there was one more issue that almost stopped this entire video right here, before we could even look at the gaming differences between these two cards. Okay, here's something interesting. What I've been doing for screen capture is an external capture right here. Now we do an external capture because this produces an extremely high quality video file while also taking none of the computer's resources. But the issue that we're facing at the moment with the AMD card is that I typically mirror the main display here to that. And it's not picking it up. There is one thing that I want to double check. So we're gonna change this to 60 and hopefully it will work. Oh, there we go, okay. Great. Once we got past that mini roadblock, it is time to see some of the differences, which presented a bit of an issue for a couple things I wanted to test. One odd thing in Cyberpunk was that the frame rate would not go above 60. There was no frame rate limiter and VSync was off in both the game and the Adrenaline application. In fact, it was happy going over 60 if it wasn't the active window and my cursor was hovering over the game, creating the heartbeat of a GPU, apparently. The way to get around this was to change to exclusive full screen in Cyberpunk. Yuck. Riva statistics worked with no issue other than losing the GPU power metric, which was also the case for hardware info, and might just be because the card is new, as the Adrenaline software was reporting it, and shows that between the two cards, the 4070 Ti is currently the better option for idle power draw, even though it's a more powerful GPU. At 1/3 the power consumption of the AMD card. And the differences don't stop there. We won't really be looking at average FPS much because that's kind of a bit too card specific, but I am interested to see stuff like frame consistency, upscaling, and even differences in visual quality. Because you'd expect the monitor to just output the same visuals, regardless of the GPU, but there can be visual differences between AMD and Nvidia, and you'll have to let me know which one you prefer. What we are looking at here is a Cyberpunk benchmark at 1440p on ultra settings. No upscaling, no frame generation, just pure raster rendering. And you'll notice the color output is slightly different. They were both recorded in the same way, on my external recorder. Neither have HDR enabled, but they definitely do look different. To me, the Nvidia one looks moodier and more saturated, which I kind of like. but really does lose visual clarity in very light or very dark environments compared to the AMD card, which retains much more visual detail at the extremes and carries into upscaling. Though Nvidia typically has the advantage here, as they can use both FSR and DLSS, the Nvidia proprietary upscaler, in theory, FSR really should work the same on both AMD and Nvidia. But when we take a look at this sign on the steps, the Nvidia card really struggled to render it at a distance. This was by far the most noticeable mistake in all of the runs, whereas the AMD card did a much better job here in terms of rendering accuracy. However, many other elements within the scene were sharper for Nvidia while using FSR. Though you are far more likely to notice an impaired sign than you are a marginally sharper graphic through a railing. And there were several other examples of Nvidia being sharper but less clear. But going back to the colour differences, this building is by far the most noticeable, which was just way too bright for Nvidia. Kicking the Nvidia card into DLSS mode, the sign that rendered much better for AMD now renders better for Nvidia. And this was the same for other examples that I saw. DLSS generally did a better job, at least in our Cyberpunk tests so far. So in this example, FSR is better on an AMD card, but DLSS still comes out on top in terms of visual fidelity. But it's worth mentioning, the only thing that I really noticed without pixel peeping was the color differences and the sign on the steps. Everything else you just won't notice in normal gameplay. And the conclusion is the same when it comes to ray tracing. FSR better on AMD and DLSS slightly better overall. But the quality of the frames is only really half the story, isn't it? Because a good gaming experience very rarely relies on visuals alone, and arguably far more important is consistency. And this is where AMD surprisingly pulled ahead, even in ray tracing with upscaling, which is where Nvidia is supposed to be fundamentally superior, especially in an Nvidia-sponsored game. This is a side-by-side of ray tracing medium, 4070 Ti using DLSS and 7800 XT using FSR. Although the Nvidia card is averaging over 20% more frames, you can see the consistency is not as good compared to the AMD run. Watch this a few times over. Go back, replay it, and pay attention to those stutters. Stutters you feel when you play. And that's really quite an important difference that really helps the fluidity of the game. So we have covered a lot here, but we've only really scratched the surface of comparing AMD to Nvidia. So let's recap the pros and cons I've experienced, which one has been better for me so far, and what we will cover in our long-term testing. Let's take a look. Let's start with the subjective. I have faced a couple issues with AMD so far, but would say that my issues are far more acceptable, and that's primarily because of my monitors. But if I did have a lot of important video calls coming up, that might change how much of an advantage AMD has been for me, but would still absolutely be a net benefit. A webcam is significantly cheaper than those monitors, but I will do further testing with a fresh Windows reinstall for the next video. Speaking of cost, both cards have similar max power specs, but the 7800 XT currently uses a decent amount more power when idling in my setup. At about 16 cents per kilowatt hour, that works out to be just over $70 a year more for the AMD card, if it was always idling and never turned off, so probably more like under 50. I also lost the ability to use DLSS upscaling and DLSS frame generation. We will compare frame generation in the next video, but for upscaling so far, I am 100% okay with this. DLSS may produce a more accurate image, but slightly less accuracy is a compelling trade-off for a more fluid experience, which is exactly what I got with AMD so far, and I'll test more games for the follow-up video. But AMD being more fluid wasn't enough for some of the ray tracing tests I did in Cyberpunk. In normal gameplay, these cards should perform quite similarly, about 10% in favour for the Nvidia card. However, in ray tracing, Nvidia's advantage pulls ahead. But I did say earlier that the advantage from Nvidia ray tracing is overrated, and I'll show you that now. Even though the Nvidia card outperformed the AMD one by about 25% in this test, much higher than the 10% raster render difference, neither card could average 60 frames per second running Cyberpunk ray tracing medium natively at 1440p. Yeah, but on paper, that is still a big improvement. So is it worth the 60% cost increase? Well, if you only play ray trace games 20% of the time, that Nvidia ray tracing performance uplift should only be worth 5% more cost to you. So no. But what about future games? Is it worth spending that extra money to get better ray tracing in the future? Well, if Cyberpunk path tracing is anything to go by, you're probably getting a new GPU at that point. And that's why I have never advocated for focusing so much money on ray tracing performance. It fundamentally just doesn't make sense for most gamers. But what does make sense is the fact that I've gained a lot more value. Between the two GPUs, I lost a little raw performance, saved $300, and got 1/3 more memory. I also could have used the 7900 XT instead, but the conclusion would be the same, at price parity. As in, I spent the same amount, but got more performance from AMD. In either example, I get more value for my money. And with that extra money, I have planned some great upgrades for my system, which is suffering from small form factor, big case syndrome. But all of the components will be linked below for you if you want to check them out. The only question is, will the AMD card remain? Well, provided that I don't run into some major issues in my long-term testing, I will be happy to keep it. And this isn't even AMD fanboyism. I am mostly happy with Nvidia, at least their performance, with several other computers that I own. And that likely won't be changing for any of them, not anytime soon. But I'm excited to give AMD a solid chance here. So I'm going to try and cover everything else in the next video, everything there. Hopefully there'll be a list right there. But if there is something that you would have wanted to see here, or something that you want to see next time, let me know in the comments section below. I want to make these videos as relevant as possible for you, and make sure that I am answering the right questions. Otherwise, to get my current unfiltered thoughts about each GPU manufacturer, check out this video, where we investigate the pros and cons of going for an Nvidia, AMD, or Intel GPU, and where you should be using one over another for a variety of use cases. And you can check that out by clicking here. Otherwise guys, share, like, subscribe, they are always appreciated, and I hope you have an amazing day.